Uncovering shadows. Leona Dorson took a deep breath as she pushed open the heavy doors of Vora Medical Institute, the large urban hospital where she'd been temporarily assigned. Though only 25, Leona was already seasoned by the long, demanding hours of hospital work. However, there was something about the vastness of Vora and the unending flow of patients that still made her pause at times. Today was one of those days. A sharp breeze blew through the entrance as Leona scanned the bustling hallways. The scent of antiseptic mixed with coffee and the quiet hum of monitors filled the air, creating a familiar but slightly overwhelming backdrop. She quickly found her way to the locker room, changing into her maroon scrubs and tying her hair back in a neat ponytail. She looked at her reflection, determined. "You're here to make a difference," she reminded herself softly, "even if it's just for a few patients." Her supervisor, head nurse Sofia Alvarez, handed her a patient chart. "You'll be caring for Clara Reynolds today," Sofia explained. "Room 304. She's an 84-year-old cardiac patient, recovering but needs careful monitoring." Leona nodded, flipping through the file as she walked. She read Clara's details. Widowed, no children, lives alone. She was a retired seamstress who had spent her years caring for other people. Now it seemed she had no one to care for her. Upon reaching Clara's room, Leona knocked gently before entering. Clara was sitting up in bed, her face turned toward the window, a distant look in her eyes. Her small frame seemed even more fragile, barely making an impression on the sterile white sheets that engulfed her. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona greeted warmly as she approached the bedside. "I'm Leona, your nurse for today. How are you feeling?" Clara turned slowly, offering a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm all right, dear. Just tired, I suppose. These walls feel so cold sometimes." Leona couldn't ignore the tremble in Clara's hands as she took her vitals and gently helped her sit up. Clara's hospital gown had faint yellow stains near the cuffs, and a sharp, acrid smell seemed to linger in the air. Leona's first instinct was that an accident had occurred. It wasn't uncommon in busy hospitals. But as she assisted Clara, there was something in the woman's gaze, a guarded, haunted look that made Leona pause. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Reynolds?" Leona asked gently, adjusting the pillows and smoothing Clara's sheets. Clara's eyes flickered, her face tightening ever so slightly. "Yes, dear. It's nothing. Just feeling my age, I guess." Leona's curiosity sparked, but she didn't want to push the elderly woman too hard. "Well, I'm here to make you comfortable, so if there's anything you need, just let me know." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "You're kind, dear. It's nice to be looked after by someone with a gentle touch." Leona stayed with Clara a bit longer, helping her take her morning medications, adjusting her bedside table, and offering small talk. Clara seemed to relax slightly, even letting out a faint chuckle at one of Leona's stories about her early days in nursing school. But when Leona excused herself to attend to other patients, Clara's face fell back into that distant, weary look that had greeted her initially. Throughout her rounds, Leona couldn't shake the image of Clara's sorrowful eyes and the faint stains on her gown. It was hard to tell if Clara had simply been ignored or if there was something else behind the sadness etched into her face. The day passed in a blur of activity as Leona attended to her other patients, but her mind often drifted back to room 304. When she returned to check on Clara in the afternoon, she noticed the same faint yellow stains on the fresh gown she had changed Clara into that morning. The acrid odor had returned as well, more potent this time. Clara looked up at Leona with a mixture of relief and hesitation, as if wanting to speak but holding herself back. "Mrs. Reynolds, would you mind if I ask you something?" Leona said softly, crouching down so she was at eye level with Clara. The elderly woman's hands tightened on the blanket. "Yes, dear. Have you had any trouble with the doctors or staff?" Leona asked carefully. "Anything unusual happening that you'd like to talk about?" Clara's face paled slightly, and her eyes darted to the door before looking back at Leona. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The doctor, Dr. Pierce. He came in last night. He was in a hurry. He didn't notice I was still awake." Leona's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice calm. "What happened?" Clara's gaze dropped, her fingers trembling. He spilled the bottle and told me to be quiet. Said it was my fault. I didn't want to make a fuss, so I just lay there." A chill ran down Leona's spine. It was strange for a doctor to handle such tasks without the assistance of a nurse, especially in a large hospital like Vora. Even stranger was Dr. Pierce's choice to leave Clara in soiled linens without calling for help. Leona took Clara's hand gently. "You don't have to feel ashamed, Mrs. Reynolds. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Clara nodded, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. But as Leona left the room, a sense of unease washed over her. She had heard stories about Dr. Pierce, stories of a doctor with a stellar reputation, but who was known to cut corners when it came to patient care. Though he was revered for his surgical expertise, rumors circulated among the nursing staff about his cold demeanor and disregard for less critical cases. Leona knew she had to tread carefully. She was, after all, just a temporary nurse, and her place at Vora was tenuous. Questioning a senior doctor could jeopardize her assignment and reputation. But Clara's downcast eyes and faint tremble haunted her, filling her with an unsettling determination to uncover what was really happening. As her shift came to an end, Leona resolved to keep a closer eye on Clara's room. If Dr. Pierce was mistreating her or any other patients, Leona needed to find out the truth. A hidden truth begins to surface. The next morning, Leona arrived at Vora Medical Institute with a new sense of purpose. She couldn't stop thinking about Clara Reynolds and the strange incident she described involving Dr. Pierce. The nurse in her urged caution. The human in her refused to ignore Clara's quiet distress. After donning her scrubs and securing her hair into a neat bun, Leona checked her assignment for the day. Clara was still under her care, which brought her a small relief. She felt a responsibility to the elderly woman, a responsibility to keep watch and protect her from whatever shadows lingered in her hospital room. As Leona stepped into room 304, Clara's face lit up, her frail hands reaching out as if she were grabbing for an anchor. "Oh, Leona, dear, it's good to see you again," Clara murmured, her voice shaky yet filled with warmth. "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Reynolds. How are you feeling today?" Clara hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the corner of her blanket. "About the same, I suppose," she whispered. "Dr. Pierce was here late last night. He said it was my fault again, that I was being difficult. I didn't mean to make trouble." Leona's heart tightened. "You're not making trouble, Mrs. Reynolds. You deserve care and respect, just like any other patient." Clara gave a small, apologetic nod, but her eyes darted toward the door, as if fearing someone might overhear. The hospital gown she wore once again showed faint yellow stains around the cuffs, and the acrid smell was unmistakable. It was becoming increasingly clear to Leona that whatever was happening here wasn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. After completing Clara's vitals and helping her with breakfast, Leona excused herself. She needed to gather more information, but she also had to tread carefully. She couldn't outright accuse a senior doctor of misconduct, especially someone as respected as Dr. Pierce. But she could quietly observe, talk to other staff members, and try to piece together any other clues that might reveal what Clara wasn't telling her. Leona's first stop was the nurse's station, where she found Sofia Alvarez, her supervisor. Sofia was a seasoned head nurse, known for her strictness, but also for her protective nature toward her staff and patients. "Sofia," Leona began, keeping her tone casual, "I have a question about Dr. Pierce. Do you know if he's the attending physician for many of the long-term patients?" Sofia raised an eyebrow, her eyes sharp and discerning. "Dr. Pierce. He's assigned to many of our critical cases, but he also takes on several patients in recovery. He's well regarded, though not particularly." Warm. Why do you ask? Leona hesitated, carefully choosing her words. I noticed something unusual with one of my patients, Clara Reynolds. She's had a few incidents with Dr. Pierce, and I just wanted to make sure I'm providing the best care possible. Sophia's expression softened. I understand, Leona. We all want to make sure our patients are comfortable. But Dr. Pierce doesn't usually take kindly to inquiries about his cases. If there's something truly concerning, however, you should let me know. It's our job to advocate for our patients, after all. Leona nodded, appreciating Sophia's measured response. She could tell that Sophia had her suspicions too, even if she wasn't voicing them outright. As the day continued, Leona made her rounds but kept a close eye on Clara's room. Each time she checked in, Clara seemed more nervous, her hands trembling and her gaze frequently darting to the door. It was as if she expected Dr. Pierce to burst in at any moment. That afternoon, as Leona helped Clara with her lunch, the elderly woman leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. He doesn't like it when I talk to the nurses, Clara confided. He says I shouldn't trouble you all. Mrs. Reynolds, Leona replied gently, placing a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. It's not trouble at all. You deserve kindness and care. If there's anything that makes you uncomfortable, please don't hesitate to tell me. Clara nodded but remained silent, her eyes cast downward. Leona could sense her internal struggle, and it broke her heart. She knew from experience that elderly patients often felt a pressure to remain silent, fearing they'd be seen as a burden or dismissed as confused. But Clara's fear seemed different, more intense, as though she knew that speaking up could bring consequences. Later that day, Leona overheard two nurses chatting in the break room. She wasn't usually one to listen in on gossip, but when she heard Dr. Pierce's name mentioned, she found herself pausing just outside the door. Did you hear about the night shift last week? One nurse was saying in a hushed tone. Dr. Pierce was in such a rush. He left one of his patients in a mess. Poor Mrs. Givens was covered in her own dinner, and he just walked out. The other nurse shook her head. He's been getting worse. They say he doesn't even bother with the patients he deems not worth his time. It's all about his reputation. He only cares about the high-profile cases. Leona felt a chill creep down her spine. Mrs. Givens, like Clara, was an elderly patient recovering from surgery. If Dr. Pierce had neglected her, it was likely he'd done the same to others. But how could he get away with it? Surely someone would have reported his behavior by now. Returning to the ward, Leona's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She needed to find out if there were other patients like Clara who had experienced similar treatment. But before she could dig deeper, she noticed Dr. Pierce walking down the hallway, his expression calm and indifferent as he headed toward Clara's room. Instinctively, Leona followed, her heart pounding. She kept a few paces behind, watching as Dr. Pierce entered Clara's room without a greeting, his demeanor cold and businesslike. Leona stepped to the side, pretending to check her notes as she tried to listen in on their conversation. Inside the room, Dr. Pierce's voice was firm, his tone almost condescending. Mrs. Reynolds, I've heard that you've been bothering the nurses again. It's not their job to listen to every little complaint. You're here to recover, so try to make it easy on everyone, all right? Clara's response was a murmur so soft that Leona couldn't make out the words. She felt a surge of anger. Clara wasn't bothering anyone. She was simply reaching out for the care and kindness she deserved. When Dr. Pierce exited the room, he noticed Leona standing nearby and offered a curt nod before walking away. But Leona caught a glimpse of his face, a flash of irritation, even disdain, as if the simple act of spending time with Clara was beneath him. Once he was out of sight, Leona slipped back into Clara's room. The elderly woman looked shaken, her frail hands clutching the edge of her blanket. She glanced at Leona with a look of apology, as if ashamed for needing comfort. Mrs. Reynolds, you don't have to be afraid of him, Leona said softly, taking the seat beside the bed. I'm here to help you, no matter what. You're not alone. Clara hesitated, then spoke in a trembling voice. I know, dear. It's just, sometimes it feels like there's no one left who cares. Dr. Pierce acts like I'm a burden. I've overheard him saying things, terrible things about patients who take up his time. Leona squeezed Clara's hand gently. You are not a burden, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm going to make sure you get the care you deserve. That evening, Leona stayed late, gathering her courage. After her shift ended, she decided to visit the head nurse again. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was happening behind closed doors. She needed Sophia's guidance on how to proceed. Sophia looked up as Leona entered, a trace of surprise in her expression. Leona, you're still here. Your shift ended half an hour ago. I know, but I couldn't leave, Leona said, taking a deep breath. I'm worried about Mrs. Reynolds, and I think Dr. Pierce might be mistreating her. She's afraid of him. And I've seen other nurses talking about similar things happening with his patients. Sophia's face tightened, and she motioned for Leona to sit down. Leona, these are serious allegations. Are you sure this isn't just a misunderstanding? Leona shook her head firmly. I know what I've seen, and I know what Clara has told me. I can't stand by and do nothing if there's a chance he's neglecting her or worse. Sophia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I appreciate your concern, Leona. I'll look into this personally, but I need you to keep this to yourself for now. Dr. Pierce has connections in this hospital, and we need concrete evidence before taking any action. Leona agreed, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. She had taken the first step, but she knew the path ahead would be challenging. Dr. Pierce was a powerful figure at Vora Medical Institute, and any attempt to expose him would require caution, patience, and unwavering determination. As she left the hospital that night, the city lights glimmering in the darkness, Leona felt a newfound resolve settle over her. She would protect Clara, no matter what it took. The truth, she knew, had a way of coming to light, and she was willing to do everything in her power to ensure that this truth did not remain buried in the shadows of Vora Medical Institute. Certainly, here's part 3, where Leona's suspicions deepen, and she faces growing challenges in her quest to protect Clara. A web of deceit. The next morning, Leona arrived early, her determination stronger than ever. Clara's trembling voice and the subtle but persistent fear in her eyes echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve. Leona knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she couldn't ignore what was happening, not when it involved the health and dignity of someone as vulnerable as Clara. After gathering her things, she made her way to room 304, preparing herself for another day of careful observation and quiet resistance. When she entered Clara's room, however, the elderly woman was asleep, her fragile form tucked under the sheets, breathing softly. Leona couldn't help but feel a pang of relief. Clara looked peaceful, untouched by the lurking shadows of Dr. Pierce's harsh treatment, if only for a moment. As she adjusted Clara's bed and glanced at her chart, a low voice from behind startled her. She seems quite attached to you, doesn't she? Leona turned to see Dr. Pierce standing in the doorway, his gaze steady and unreadable. His sudden appearance made her heart race, but she maintained her composure, reminding herself of her duty. I try to make all my patients feel comfortable, Dr. Pierce, she replied, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Reynolds has been through a lot, and I just want to make sure she's cared for properly. Dr. Pierce stepped into the room, his gaze lingering on Clara for a moment before returning to Leona. His voice was cold, almost dismissive. Patients like Mrs. Reynolds, they're in decline. Sometimes the most comfort we can provide is helping them accept their limitations. Leona felt a surge of anger at his callous tone. Respect and dignity are never limitations, Dr. Pierce. Regardless of a patient's condition, they deserve our full attention and care. A flicker of irritation crossed Dr. Pierce's face, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Spoken like a nurse with a lot of heart, but heart doesn't always translate to results. He adjusted his cufflinks and gave her a measured look. Just remember your place, Nurse Dorson, and remember who makes the decisions here. Without waiting for a response, Dr. Pierce turned and strode out of the room, leaving Leona alone with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The arrogance, the complete lack of empathy. How could someone like that be trusted with lives? Clara stirred, slowly opening her eyes and glancing around. When she saw Leona, her face relaxed, though a shadow of worry remained. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said softly, brushing a stray strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "How are you feeling today?" Clara managed a small smile. "Better now that you're here, dear. I had a rough night." Dr. Pierce. He came in again, right before midnight. Leona's stomach tightened. Midnight rounds weren't typical for Dr. Pierce, especially with patients in recovery rather than critical care. The more she learned, the stranger things seemed. "What happened, Mrs. Reynolds? Did he say anything to you?" Clara looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was upset with me. Said I was being difficult, that I should stop calling for assistance. I don't know why he thinks I'm a burden." Leona knelt by Clara's bed, her voice gentle yet firm. "Mrs. Reynolds, you are not a burden. You deserve respect and care, just like any other patient. If anything bothers you or makes you uncomfortable, please tell me." Clara hesitated, and for a moment, Leona thought she might hold back. But then Clara spoke, her voice trembling. "There's more, dear. Last night, after he finished checking my chart, he spilled my dinner tray on purpose. Said I was wasting his time, then left me in the mess. I didn't want to call anyone else. I was afraid." Leona's heart ached with anger and sorrow. She knew Dr. Pierce was dismissive, but this was cruelty. It wasn't just neglect. It was intentional harm meant to shame and belittle. With a renewed sense of purpose, Leona helped Clara clean up, carefully noting the yellow stains on her gown and the faint but lingering smell of spilled food. She would need to gather evidence, something undeniable that would force the administration to take Clara's situation seriously. After ensuring Clara was settled, Leona left the room and headed to the nurse's station, her mind racing. She would have to be discreet, but she needed to know more about Dr. Pierce's other patients. If Clara wasn't the only one suffering from his mistreatment, she could build a case that no one could ignore. While at the station, she saw Cynthia, a nurse she'd worked with briefly on her first day at Vora. Cynthia had been around long enough to know about the inner workings of the hospital. Leona approached her carefully, choosing her words with precision. "Hey, Cynthia," Leona said, leaning on the counter casually. "Quick question. Have you ever worked with Dr. Pierce?" Cynthia raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. "I have on a few shifts. He's efficient, but not exactly warm." Leona forced a smile. "Efficient is one way to put it. I've noticed he's got quite a lot of long-term patients under his care. Have you ever heard any unusual complaints?" Cynthia glanced around, lowering her voice. "Well, there are rumors. Some patients have been left unattended, others neglected. I've heard stories, but they're always brushed off. Pierce has a reputation, but he's got connections too. It's hard to challenge someone with his standing." Leona nodded, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Thanks, Cynthia. I wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining things." As Cynthia returned to her work, Leona's mind raced. If Dr. Pierce had neglected or mistreated multiple patients, it wouldn't just be an isolated case. This was a pattern, a systemic failure that had gone unchecked for far too long. For the rest of the day, Leona kept a close eye on Clara, making sure she was comfortable and well cared for. As her shift drew to a close, she slipped back to the nurse's station and checked the patient logs, skimming through the names of patients in Dr. Pierce's care. Each name was a potential piece of evidence, a possible connection to expose the extent of his neglect. That evening, Leona decided to make one more stop before heading home. She knew of a retired nurse, Patricia Ellis, who had worked at Vora for decades before retiring just a year earlier. Patricia was known to speak her mind, and Leona hoped she might have insights into Dr. Pierce's history. Leona drove to Patricia's home, her heart racing with anticipation. She had never visited Patricia outside the hospital, but her instincts told her that the older nurse might be able to help. Patricia greeted Leona warmly, inviting her in and offering a cup of tea. They chatted for a bit, exchanging stories about the ups and downs of hospital life, but Patricia soon sensed that Leona had a deeper reason for visiting. "All right, Leona," Patricia said, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "What brings you here this evening? You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." Leona took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've been working with one of Dr. Pierce's patients, a woman named Clara Reynolds. She's been neglected, left in unsanitary conditions, and she's terrified of him. I've heard rumors about Dr. Pierce, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions without knowing more." Patricia's expression darkened. "Dr. Pierce, he's always been a bit of a golden boy around here. Skilled, but ruthless. I remember a few incidents where patients were left in discomfort. He always managed to talk his way out of it. The administration values his results, but they've turned a blind eye to his behavior for years." Leona felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "How has he gotten away with this?" Patricia sighed, her gaze somber. "He knows how to cover his tracks. The higher-ups see him as an asset, and they don't want to lose him. It's the vulnerable patients who suffer, the ones who don't have families to speak up for them." Leona's resolve strengthened. "Clara deserves better. They all do. I can't let this continue." Patricia studied her with a hint of admiration. "If you're serious about this, Leona, you'll need more than words. Document everything. Photos, records, witness statements, anything that can be used as proof. Don't trust anyone in the administration until you're ready to present it all." Leona nodded, her heart pounding with determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, and that challenging someone as powerful as Dr. Pierce could cost her career. But she couldn't look away, not when Clara and countless other vulnerable patients needed her to stand up. After thanking Patricia, Leona returned home, her mind buzzing with a mixture of fear and resolve. She would gather the evidence, document every detail, and build a case that would force Vora Medical Institute to confront the truth. As she lay in bed that night, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but one remained clear and steady. She wouldn't let Clara suffer in silence. Not anymore. Tomorrow, she would begin her fight, and she would be ready for whatever came next. The battle begins. The next morning, Leona arrived at Vora Medical Institute with her heart set on a plan. She would need to be meticulous and careful, gathering every possible piece of evidence she could without drawing attention to herself. The stakes were high. She was risking her job, her career, and perhaps even her safety. But the thought of Clara's frightened eyes and trembling hands steeled her resolve. After slipping into her scrubs and securing her hair into a bun, Leona made her way to room 304 to check on Clara. The elderly woman was awake, staring out the window, her thin fingers gripping the blanket. Her frailty seemed even more pronounced today, as if each hour in the hospital drained her of strength. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona greeted softly, offering her a warm smile as she approached the bedside. "How did you sleep?" Clara looked at Leona with a faint smile, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "I slept all right, dear, thank you. Though, Dr. Pierce was here again last night." Leona's pulse quickened. "He was? What happened?" Clara hesitated, her gaze drifting to the door before she continued. "He said I was wasting resources, taking up space. He was so harsh, so angry." A surge of protective anger welled up inside Leona. How could anyone treat a vulnerable patient like Clara with such cruelty? But Leona knew she had to keep her emotions in check. If she was going to help Clara, she had to stay calm and focused. "I'll be here with you as much as I can," Leona assured her gently, taking Clara's hand. "You're not alone in this. I'll make sure you get the care you deserve." Clara's expression softened, and for a moment, she seemed comforted. Leona went about her duties with extra care, taking note of any details she thought might be relevant later on. She made sure Clara's room was spotless, her bedding fresh and clean, and her needs fully attended to. She also discreetly documented the yellow stains and any other signs of neglect, just as Patricia had advised. As the day went on, Leona gathered bits and pieces of information from various sources, careful to avoid raising suspicion. She listened intently to the conversations at the nurse's station, hoping to overhear anything that might give her clues about Dr. Pierce's behavior. But her efforts were interrupted when head nurse Sophia approached her with a somber expression. "Leona, could I see you in my office?" Sophia's tone was neutral, but her eyes held a hint of concern. Leona's heart sank. She followed Sophia to the office, bracing herself for whatever was coming. Inside, Sophia gestured for her to sit down and took a seat across from her. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Mrs. Reynolds," Sophia began, her gaze steady. "I appreciate your dedication, but I want to remind you that as a temporary nurse, your role here is to support the team without getting too involved in any specific patient's case." Leona held Sophia's gaze, trying to keep her tone respectful. "I understand, Sophia, but I believe Mrs. Reynolds isn't receiving the care she needs. I've seen signs of neglect, and I'm concerned about her interactions with Dr. Pierce." Sophia's face tightened, and she leaned forward. "Leona, you're treading on dangerous ground. Dr. Pierce is a respected physician here, and making allegations without concrete evidence could have serious consequences, not just for you, but for the hospital as well." Leona took a steadying breath. "I'm not making accusations without reason, Sophia. Mrs. Reynolds has shared things with me, things that no patient should have to endure. I believe her, and I feel it's my duty to protect her." Sophia sighed, her expression conflicted. "I understand your concern, Leona. Truly, I do. But Dr. Pierce has been with us for years. He's brought in significant funding and has connections that go far beyond this hospital. If you're going to pursue this, you need to be certain you have solid proof, more than just observations and patient accounts." Leona nodded, feeling both frustrated and determined. "I'll be careful, Sophia, but I can't ignore what's happening. Thank you for understanding." Sophia studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Just be cautious. I'd hate to see your career jeopardized over this." As Leona left Sophia's office, she felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Sophia hadn't dismissed her concerns outright, but the warning was clear. If she wanted to make a case against Dr. Pierce, she would have to tread carefully. Determined to gather more evidence, Leona decided to take her investigation to the next level. She began quietly documenting every interaction between Dr. Pierce and his patients, especially any moments that hinted at neglect or mistreatment. She jotted down notes on her phone, careful to keep her observations factual and detailed, just as Patricia had advised. One afternoon, as she was walking down the hall, she noticed Dr. Pierce exiting room 307, a room occupied by another elderly patient, Mr. Larkin, who had recently suffered a stroke. She watched as Dr. Pierce left the room without even a glance back, his expression cold and indifferent. Curious, Leona waited until Dr. Pierce was out of sight before slipping into Mr. Larkin's room. The elderly man lay in his bed, his face pale and strained, his breathing shallow. "Mr. Larkin, are you all right?" Leona asked gently, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Mr. Larkin's eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a weak nod. I'm fine, dear. Just tired. The doctor said I need to stop complaining." Leona's heart ached at his words. Another patient, another soul silenced by Dr. Pierce's callousness. She stayed with Mr. Larkin for a few moments, making sure he was comfortable and adjusting his pillows to ease his breathing. It was clear that he, like Clara, had been treated as a burden rather than a human being deserving of dignity and care. Over the next few days, Leona continued her observations, documenting each instance of neglect, each whispered plea for help, each hint of fear in the eyes of Dr. Pierce's patients. She knew she was amassing a dangerous amount of information, but she couldn't turn back now. One evening, as her shift was ending, Leona found herself alone in the nurse's station, reviewing her notes one last time before heading home. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. "What are you doing, Nurse Dorson?" Leona froze, her heart pounding as she turned to see Dr. Pierce standing in the doorway, his gaze sharp and unyielding. His eyes flicked to the notebook in her hand, and she quickly closed it, holding it close to her chest. "Just finishing up some notes on my patients," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Dr. Pierce's lips twisted into a cold smile. "I see. And is Mrs. Reynolds one of those patients? I've noticed you've taken quite an interest in her." Leona forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm just doing my job, Dr. Pierce. Mrs. Reynolds is in my care, and I want to make sure she receives the attention she needs." Dr. Pierce took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Be careful, Nurse Dorson. You're here on a temporary assignment. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself without a position because you couldn't keep your curiosity in check." Leona swallowed, feeling a wave of fear wash over her, but she held her ground. "I'm here to care for my patients, Dr. Pierce. If that's a problem, then maybe the problem isn't with me." For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a chilling stare. "Watch yourself," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "You don't know who you're dealing with." With that, he turned and strode out of the nurse's station, leaving Leona shaken but resolute. She knew now that she was on the right path. Dr. Pierce's reaction had confirmed it. But she also knew that the stakes had just been raised. He would be watching her now, and any misstep could cost her everything. That night, Leona went home and reviewed her notes, making copies of every detail she had documented. She stored them in a secure place, knowing she would need them if things escalated. She was no longer just a nurse caring for a patient. She was a whistleblower, someone risking everything to protect the vulnerable. As she lay in bed, her mind churned with worry and fear, but a sense of purpose burned within her. She couldn't let Dr. Pierce continue his reign unchecked. Clara, Mr. Larkin, and all the others deserved someone willing to stand up for them, someone unafraid to bring the truth to light. Leona knew that the battle was only just beginning, but she was prepared to face whatever came her way, armed with the truth and an unbreakable resolve to see justice done. The turning point. Leona arrived at Vora Medical Institute the next day feeling the surge of determination. Her encounter with Dr. Pierce had left her shaken, but his thinly veiled threats only strengthened her resolve. She couldn't let him intimidate her, not when Clara, Mr. Larkin, and others were relying on her. As she walked down the hall toward the nurse's station, she reminded herself of her purpose. The patients under Dr. Pierce's care were suffering in silence, and if no one else would stand up for them, she would. Throughout her shift, Leona maintained a careful routine, documenting everything discreetly. She spent time with Clara, noting the faint yellow stains on her gown and the acrid smell that seemed to linger despite the new bedding. Clara looked more exhausted than ever, and Leona worried that the constant fear of Dr. Pierce was draining her faster than her illness. While checking on Mr. Larkin later that morning, Leona noticed similar signs. His eyes were dull, his hands trembled, and he seemed almost resigned to his suffering. It was clear that he, like Clara, had been emotionally worn down by Dr. Pierce's cold, dismissive treatment. "Mr. Larkin," Leona said softly, adjusting his blanket, "if there's anything you need, anything at all, please let me know." He looked at her with a glimmer of gratitude, his voice a faint whisper. "Thank you, dear. You're very kind. Dr. Pierce doesn't think much of us old-timers, but you make it bearable." Leona felt a pang of sadness. Mr. Larkin, like Clara, had likely lived a life filled with dignity and independence, only to be reduced to someone dismissed and forgotten. She resolved once more that she wouldn't let these patients be mistreated, no matter what. By midday, Leoma decided it was time to take a more direct step. She knew she couldn't gather evidence alone. She needed someone within the hospital administration to listen, to take her concerns seriously. After some deliberation, she decided to visit Dr. Naomi Gray, the hospital's patient advocate. Dr. Gray had a reputation for fairness and was known to stand up for patient rights. If anyone could help, it would be her. Leona found Dr. Gray's office on the third floor, tucked away in a quiet corridor. She knocked lightly, feeling her heart race. A moment later, a calm voice called out, "Come in." Dr. Gray was a tall woman in her late 40s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and a thoughtful, attentive gaze. She looked up from her desk, a warm but curious smile on her face as Leona entered. "Hello, can I help you?" Dr. Gray asked, gesturing for Leona to take a seat. Leona took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Dr. Gray, my name is Leona Dorson. I'm a temporary nurse here, and I've been seeing some things that have me concerned. It's about Dr. Pierce and his treatment of certain patients." Dr. Gray's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "Go on." Leona recounted everything she'd observed: the neglect, the dismissive attitude, and the disturbing incidents with Clara Reynolds and Mr. Larkin. She told Dr. Gray about the stains, the patients left in soiled gowns, and the emotional strain on the elderly patients under Dr. Pierce's care. Dr. Gray listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Leona," Dr. Gray said once Leona had finished. "Dr. Pierce has a high-profile position here, which can sometimes mean certain behaviors go unchecked. But what you're describing goes beyond mere negligence." Leona nodded, feeling a surge of relief. "I just couldn't stand by and do nothing. Mrs. Reynolds is so scared, and Mr. Larkin. It's like he's lost his will to fight. They deserve better." Dr. Gray sighed, looking down at her hands. "I've had complaints about Dr. Pierce before, but nothing concrete enough to take action. You've provided more detail than anyone else has so far. If you're willing, I'd like you to continue gathering evidence. I'll support you, but we need irrefutable proof to confront him and involve the hospital board." Leona agreed, feeling a newfound sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had an ally, someone within the administration who was willing to help. Over the next week, Leona continued her work, but this time with a new intensity. She began taking photographs of the stained gowns and recording her interactions with patients, always ensuring she was discreet. She kept her conversations with Dr. Gray private, meeting in her office during lunch breaks to discuss any new findings. One evening, as Leona was wrapping up her shift, she noticed Sophia, the head nurse, waiting near the nurse's station with a troubled expression. "Leona, can I speak with you?" Sophia's voice was tense, and Leona immediately felt a knot form in her stomach. She followed Sophia into an empty conference room, closing the door behind them. Sophia turned to her, arms crossed, her gaze sharp but filled with concern. "I've heard that you've been digging into Dr. Pierce's cases," Sophia began, "and I know you've been meeting with Dr. Gray. Leona, do you have any idea what you're up against?" Leona met Sophia's gaze, trying to keep her voice steady. "I do, Sophia, but I can't ignore what I've seen. Patients are suffering under Dr. Pierce's care, and someone has to speak up for them." Sophia's face softened, and she sighed heavily. "I admire your courage, Leona. I really do. But Dr. Pierce isn't just any doctor here. He's backed by the board and has connections that run deep. Going after him could end your career, not just here, but at any hospital." Leona nodded, already aware of the risks. "I know, Sophia, but I can't turn a blind eye. Clara Reynolds deserves better, and so does every other patient in his care." Sophia placed a hand on Leona's shoulder, her expression resigned but supportive. "Then you'll need more than just notes and photos. You'll need witness testimonies, statements from patients, something that can't be dismissed as speculation." Leona thanked Sophia, feeling both encouraged and anxious. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but with each passing day, her resolve only grew stronger. The next day, Leona decided to speak with Clara directly about the possibility of making a statement. She knew it was a lot to ask, but Clara's testimony would carry more weight than anything Leona could document alone. When she entered Clara's room, the elderly woman looked frail, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for Leona. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said gently, taking a seat beside the bed. I wanted to ask you something, but only if you feel comfortable." Clara looked at her, eyes wide with apprehension. "What is it, dear?" Leona took a deep breath. "If I could arrange a way for you to tell someone about Dr. Pierce, someone who could help you, would you be willing to speak up? You wouldn't be alone. I'd be there with you every step of the way." Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting to the door as if fearing Dr. Pierce might walk in at any moment. I don't know, dear. He's powerful, isn't he? He could make things very difficult for us." Leona gently took Clara's hand. "I know it's scary, but you have a right to speak up. No one should have to go through what you've endured. You're not alone in this. There are people who want to help, people who believe in you." Clara looked at Leona, a glimmer of hope mingling with the fear in her eyes. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. If it means this won't happen to anyone else, then I'll do it." Leona felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. I promise we'll make sure you're safe." Over the next few days, Leona worked closely with Dr. Gray to arrange a confidential interview for Clara. Dr. Gray assured her that the interview would be handled discreetly and that Clara's safety would be their top priority. In the meantime, Leona continued documenting everything, knowing that the evidence was slowly building. But as the day of Clara's interview approached, Leona felt a growing sense of unease. Dr. Pierce seemed to be watching her more closely, his gaze lingering whenever they passed each other in the hall. She knew he suspected something, but she couldn't let fear deter her now. On the morning of the interview, Leona arrived early, helping Clara prepare and offering reassurance. Clara was visibly nervous, her hand shaking as she clutched Leona's hand for support. "It'll be okay, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona whispered. "You're doing the right thing. We're all here for you." Clara nodded, a flicker of courage in her eyes. She straightened, her fragile form seeming stronger as she prepared to face the truth. Dr. Gray soon arrived, giving Leona a nod before leading Clara to the private office where the interview would take place. As the door closed behind them, Leona felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. They were finally taking a stand, finally shining a light on the shadows that had plagued Clara and so many others. But Leona knew this was only the beginning. Dr. Pierce wouldn't go down without a fight, and the true battle was yet to come. Justice and redemption. Leona paced anxiously outside Dr. Gray's office, glancing at her watch as the minutes ticked by. Inside, Clara was recounting her experiences, her voice faint but steady as she revealed the pain and indignities she'd endured. Leona knew that this testimony could change everything, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Just as she steadied herself against the wall, a familiar voice sent a chill down her spine. "Nurse Dorson." Dr. Pierce's voice was calm, but laced with menace. He stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes cold and calculating. "A word, if you don't mind." Leona felt a surge of adrenaline, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Of course, Dr. Pierce," she replied, walking toward him with a steady gaze. He led her to an empty conference room, closing the door with a deliberate click. The room was silent, the fluorescent lights casting an almost harsh glow that seemed to sharpen every line of Dr. Pierce's face. "I know what you're doing," he began, his tone dangerously calm. "And I must say, I'm disappointed. I thought you were a professional, Nurse Dorson." Leona met his gaze head-on, feeling her anger simmer beneath the surface. "Being a professional means advocating for patients who can't defend themselves, Dr. Pierce. Mrs. Reynolds and others like her deserve care and respect, not neglect and cruelty. Dr. Pierce's lips twisted into a mocking smile. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? A temporary nurse, fresh out of training, taking on a respected physician like me. It's almost laughable. Leona felt her fists clench, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not the only one who sees what's happening, Dr. Pierce. You've crossed a line, and people are finally starting to take notice. His face hardened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I've built my career on reputation, on results. Do you really think anyone will believe the word of a few confused, elderly patients over mine? Leona didn't back down. I think they'll believe the evidence, and they'll believe the people who are brave enough to speak up. For a moment, Dr. Pierce's mask slipped, and she saw a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by anger, and he turned away, his shoulders tense. You've made a mistake, Nurse Dorson, he said, his voice low and menacing. And I assure you, you will regret it. With that, he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Leona stood there, her heart pounding, a mixture of fear and defiance surging through her veins. She knew this confrontation had changed things. Dr. Pierce wasn't going to let her actions go unanswered. When she returned to Dr. Gray's office, she found Clara sitting in a chair, looking exhausted but relieved. Dr. Gray offered Leona a reassuring nod. Clara's testimony was powerful. Leona, Dr. Gray said quietly. We have enough to start an investigation. Clara reached for Leona's hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, dear. I don't know what I would have done without you. Leona smiled, squeezing Clara's hand gently. You were so brave, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm so proud of you. Over the next few days, the investigation gained momentum. Dr. Gray and Sophia discreetly gathered testimonies from other nurses, compiling evidence of Dr. Pierce's history of mistreatment and neglect. Leona felt a sense of relief mixed with anxiety. Though they were making progress, she knew Dr. Pierce wasn't going to let this go without a fight. One afternoon, as Leona was tending to another patient, she was called to the head administrator's office. Her heart raced as she walked down the hall, unsure of what awaited her. Inside, Dr. Gray, Sophia, and Mr. Crane, the head administrator, were seated around a conference table. Mr. Crane gestured for her to sit. Leona, Mr. Crane began, his expression serious. Dr. Pierce has filed a formal complaint against you, citing unprofessional conduct and interference with patient care. Leona felt a surge of anger, but kept her tone calm. Mr. Crane, I was advocating for my patients, who were suffering under Dr. Pierce's care. I brought my concerns to Dr. Gray because I believe in providing ethical and compassionate treatment. Dr. Gray interjected, her voice steady. Leona's actions were justified. The testimonies we've gathered confirm patterns of neglect that go beyond simple oversight. We cannot ignore these findings. Mr. Crane sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand your position, Dr. Gray, but Dr. Pierce has been a valuable asset to this hospital. Removing him based on the words of a few patients and a temporary nurse would have serious repercussions. Leona spoke up, her voice unwavering. I understand Dr. Pierce's reputation, Mr. Crane, but that doesn't excuse his treatment of vulnerable patients. If we ignore this, we're complicit in the harm he's caused. Mr. Crane looked at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes. I admire your courage, Leona. But this decision isn't mine alone. The board will review the evidence, and I'll ensure they consider everything carefully. Leona left the meeting with a sense of unease. She knew the board's decision could go either way, but she also knew that, regardless of the outcome, she had done everything in her power to protect her patients. As the investigation continued, Dr. Pierce became increasingly hostile, his resentment toward Leona evident in every interaction. He no longer bothered with veiled threats, making it clear that he intended to see her removed from the hospital. But Leona refused to back down. She continued caring for her patients with the same compassion and dedication, knowing that her actions were her best defense. A week later, the board convened to review the findings. Leona, Dr. Gray, and Sophia were called to the meeting, along with Dr. Pierce. The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Crane presented the evidence, outlining the patterns of neglect and mistreatment that had emerged through the testimonies and documentation. Dr. Pierce defended himself with calculated charm, dismissing the allegations as misunderstandings and accusing Leona of overstepping her role. He painted himself as a dedicated physician, claiming that any lapses were due to the pressures of his demanding position. Leona listened, feeling her anger rise as he twisted the truth. When it was her turn to speak, she held her head high, recounting her experiences with clarity and conviction. "I came to Vora Medical Institute to provide compassionate care," she began, her voice steady. "When I saw patients being neglected, I couldn't ignore it. Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Larkin, and others have suffered in silence because they feared retaliation. I spoke up because they deserved a voice, because every patient deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." When she finished, the room was silent. The board members exchanged glances, some looking troubled, others unreadable. Finally, Mr. Crane stood, addressing the room. "We have a responsibility to uphold the highest standards of care in this institution," he said, his tone solemn. "After reviewing the evidence, it's clear that changes must be made." Dr. Pierce's face hardened, but he remained silent. "Effective immediately, Dr. Pierce, you are suspended pending further investigation," Mr. Crane continued. "We cannot allow this pattern of behavior to continue unchecked." Leona felt a surge of relief and gratitude, her heart pounding as she realized the gravity of what they had achieved. She glanced at Dr. Gray and Sophia, who offered her quiet nods of encouragement. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Pierce left without a word, his expression dark and unforgiving. Leona knew that this victory had come at a cost, but she also knew it was worth it. Clara, Mr. Larkin, and so many others would finally receive the care they deserved. In the days that followed, Leona was praised by patients and colleagues alike. Clara's condition improved with each passing day, her spirit renewed by the knowledge that she had been heard. Mr. Larkin and other patients expressed their gratitude, their fear giving way to a newfound sense of hope. On her last day at Vora, Leona stopped by Clara's room one final time. Clara reached out, clasping Leona's hand with surprising strength. "You saved me, dear," Clara whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You reminded me that even in darkness, there are still people who care." Leona smiled, a lump forming in her throat. "You reminded me why I became a nurse, Mrs. Reynolds. Thank you for trusting me." As she left the hospital, Leona felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had faced opposition, risked her career, and stood up against someone powerful, all for the sake of compassion and justice. In doing so, she had made a difference, one that would resonate long after she was gone. Walking out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Leona felt a surge of pride and purpose. She knew her journey was only beginning, and that she would carry the lessons from Vora with her always. She was more than a nurse. She was an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, and a protector